Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We appreciate you taking some time out of your day to listen to us talk about culture and what we're trying to do at Bonfire Studios. But first, we should talk a little bit about the way, where Bonfire Studios came from and your why about Bonfire.
So I guess it started, I took some time off after my time at Blizzard. And then after, spending a year and a half off, I was thinking about what to do next. And, I've obviously still loved games. I thought about other opportunities, but, I got to know Min Kim quite a bit. And, we really kind of talked about what's a different sort of game studio that we could create, and wanted to make a studio that we really felt like could focus on culture along with the game experiences.
So then how do you go about actually starting to make that happen?
Yeah, so I think the first thing you have to do is really think about how you're going to fund the studio, since one of the things I learned from talking to a lot of other entrepreneurs is the seeds for what will happen eventually to your studio can happen really early on to how you fund your games, how you fund your studio. And I think for us, we really aspire to be independent and be independent for a very long time.
Okay, so then how do you actually accomplish that when you're trying to raise money?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different paths you can choose. In our case, we decided to find investors. And we talked to a lot of different folks, and I think we were fortunate enough to try to find investors that really had a long-term vision to what we want to build. And we kind of had a really interesting pitch deck, which usually does not work real well. But for us, it was like, hey, investors, we want to get a lot of money, and then we want to use that money to hire really great developers that I think startups usually can't hire. And then we're going to give that team the ability to pick the game that they want to build that makes sense for that team.
Did you talk about culture with any of the investors you were talking to?
We talked about, I think, what it takes to build a great game development team, and why focusing really on a team and the talented folks is what long-term will bring value. And we really want to talk to investors that want to talk about exits. So if an investor is like, oh, we have a 5-year time horizon and we want you to IPO, then it just wasn't interesting to us. So we really wanted to find an investor like, hey, our job is to build a really valuable company, and we're going to do a lot of things to do that. And long term, we think that will turn into a great return for the investors, but we're not really going to focus on how to exit. We're going to focus how to build a great long-lasting company.
So then you were looking for people who would give you the time that you needed, as well as giving you a little bit of autonomy to be able to create those teams.
Exactly.
So then now you have money, and how do you actually go about putting together that sort of like those people who are going to drive the vision forward?
Yeah, so we took a lot of time doing that, since we really weren't in the move fast and break things sort of model. We're in the, hey, let's really hire great people that want to build a long-lasting company and want to really focus on a company that has a great culture as much as we focus on the content we want to make. So, we talked a lot about, well, what are the things that great game developers really want, and how do we optimize a culture around that? So like good examples are, in a lot of bigger companies, people can make really great games, they can make AAA games, but usually have to do that on really large teams. And oftentimes I think what you find the best developers, they kind of want both. They want to be able to make really awesome games, but they want to have a big impact on the product, and they don't want to be in meetings all day long. So I think a lot of like the early Bonfire was, hey, we should optimize around making much smaller teams that can really focus on making great games and having an impact, wearing multiple hats, everyone can be involved in the game design, kind of things like that.
So what do you mean when you say small teams? Like how small are we talking about?
Yeah, so, we're going to feel that out a little bit, but, right now we're looking at the 20 to 25 realm. And some of this also came out of, one of the last games I worked on at Blizzard was Hearthstone. And Hearthstone was kind of a contrarian project within Blizzard at the time, where we were trying to figure out, could we make a great Blizzard game with only 15 game developers? And the thing that I think really changed in that era was, if you make different sort of decisions, like you don't decide to build your own game engine from scratch, you use something like Unity, you really start thinking about like how do you scope the project small enough, you can end up still making a really big commercial product. And the big learning, I think, was that team, was able to all be in one room, had no communication overhead, They went on camping trips together. They weren't burned out by the time they shipped the game. They were actually ready to now keep on servicing their community. And I think that's a lot of what we're trying to optimize for a Bonfire is can we build teams like that and then continue to invest in those teams so that they continue to drive their product and inspire their community.
I mean, I think another interesting part of that story of having the small teams is that you don't have a lot of the management overhead. And that's something that we've been focusing on a lot.
Yeah, so the other thing that I think you kind of see happen with kind of your typical companies that have success is they scale, they become much larger, they have to add lots of middle management, to be able to kind of manage the complexity of the entire organization. I think what we want to try to do is try to resist the urge to grow large, even if we're lucky enough to get successful. So I think, when you look at Blizzard, Mike's in the room, Blizzard, we went from a very small studio to like 4,000 or 5,000 people today. I think our hope would be if we're successful in the long term, we look more like a Valve or a Supercell, more in like the 300 to 400 person range over a long time horizon. But still with these really awesome smaller teams that we really entrust to drive their business and drive their games.
So we're talking about sort of this idea of having these small autonomous teams within the larger organization. I mean, you can talk a little bit maybe about how how that team actually chose what to work on.
Yeah, so we get a little bit on the journey, right? So we raise the money, we finally have enough people where we can start talking about the games we want to build. So we kind of had to custom design a process for how to do that. And we didn't really, I wouldn't say at the time we knew exactly what the design was going to be. We kind of felt along. But we went through a process where we really encouraged everyone in the company to pitch game ideas. Even people that haven't traditionally done it, like you got to pitch a couple game ideas.
I did.
And I think there is that time period where we're really trying to get the studio to be really creative. But the problem was we would have the challenge where some people are pitching game ideas and you might have an artist that just shows 50 slides of artwork. So it's like, how do you even compare those two things? So we kind of came up with this idea of like a game seed, which is, just a 5-page slide deck, which just answers really basic questions. Like what is the game? What is the world? Kind of what's the positioning statement? Like what's the game DNA? And then we went through like 40 of those ideas where, we pitched out all of them. And then we went through a process where we gave everyone in the studio very scientifically 5 Post-it notes each, and everyone had to sign their name on it, and they had to go around and vote which were the 5 ideas that they were most excited about. Which then kind of led to a lot of really interesting discussions because this might imply that we're a democracy. We're not really. It's just this is a way to surface everyone's like product values. Because we learned some really interesting things about the studio. So like anything that didn't have like a deep and memorable world idea got downvoted. So we had a couple ideas that we really thought could be great games, could bring friends together, but might have been more like modern day and didn't have a real deep IP. But our studio was not really that interested in voting those ideas up. So we found out, well, I guess that's going to be a thing for us. We're going to be a studio that makes imaginary worlds. And then we had a few other kind of like markers like that, those were product values. And then we somehow, through a lot of discussion, picked 7 of these ideas to push forward into the next phase, which then, of course, we call game saplings. Because we have the little seeds, they're going to slowly grow, still very fragile, but if we keep on watering them, hopefully these one day will turn into games. So then, this is the first time we actually acted like a game studio. We actually had the entire studio work on these saplings one by one. And kind of the rule was, the beginning of that 1 to 2 week period, we have to all pretend like we're going to make this game. We have to fall in love with this idea, and now we're going to try to answer a lot more questions. We're going to try to dig into the gameplay. We're going to start talking about risk. We're going to talk about target audience. And by the end of this, we ended up with decks that I think we probably could have gone out and pitched publishers if we really wanted to. But the whole intent was, we get to do that thing which usually game studios don't get to do. We're going to take these 7 ideas, and then we're going to pitch them internally and let the team actually pick the game that they're going to make. So we did that, and then that was a really long day for our game director, Josh.
It was.
Yes.
He pitched all of the games.
Yes.
And I do have to say that it was interesting to see throughout the entire process, the games were, there were a lot of different genres represented.
Yeah. Like, that's another thing I think we learned is that we're not going to be partial to a particular genre, and I think, there's a lot of studios that are really good at making first-person shooter games. I was very, very fortunate in my career at Blizzard where I got to work on a ton of genres. I got to work on RTS games, action RPGs, MMORPGs, card battlers, first-person shooters, and I think there's just something special when you can be creative and bring something new to each genre you work on. So I'm hoping that each of these saplings one day we'll get to, and this may eventually be the next 7 games we build. But then we had the really hard challenge of, okay, if they're all pitched, now how do we choose? And again, I don't think we really had it figured out at the time, but just to see where people are at, we had everyone stack rank all the games. And the question was, stack rank the games in the order that you think Bonfire should make them. And if you don't think Bonfire should make any of these games, just leave it off your stack ranking. So you can kind of see that there was a lot of passion for all the games, because I think the majority of the studio had all 7 games on their stack ranking, and every game but one had at least one number 1 vote. So it's a little bit challenging right there. It's like, well, how are we going to pick? So we spent like a couple days really just kind of talking through the pros and cons, talking about our product values, like how deep and memorable is each idea or each world, things like that. We also had the opportunity to have everyone defend their stack rankings, which was, okay, why did you have game as number 1? Why is this 1 second, so forth, so on. And it was really interesting because everyone brought a very different perspective. Some people did their stack rankings purely based on what they thought would have the most commercial success. So some people would do it based on what they would be really good at building. And of course, we had someone that had the grand strategy of how we're going to build the tech stack through all 7 games and the really smart decisions of how we're going to get through all of them. And I think what was really eye-opening for everybody is everyone kind of had their blinders on and assumed everyone was going to stack rank the way that they did. But that isn't really what happened. But I think what also happened was everyone learned a lot about all the different ideas, looking it through the lens of each person and how they did the stack ranking. So after all this, a couple days, I asked everyone to restack rank the games, but this time I gave them a prompt. And the prompt was, stack rank in the order that you think this group of people could make the very best version of that game. Like, where's our studio leverage? Like, what are the things that the artists would draw in their spare time even if you didn't pay them? And we ended up with a game that was almost unanimous. So we're very excited, came out of that process, everyone's really amped up, and now we're on the journey to making our first game.
Which we're not really going to be talking about too much here, but we can talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, we're not doing the big grand reveal where we're going to suddenly, oh, okay, everybody, here's the big.
No.
Yeah, I don't think you'd ever let me do that.
No. So we can talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, a little bit.
Like our purpose is to build friendships. So you can learn a little bit about what is valuable to us as a company from that, which means building these friendships between gamers. So.
Yeah, we haven't been shy. Like, all 7 of these ideas are online multiplayer games. They're going to be, you can play them with other people. So some of the ideas were cooperative games, some of them were competitive games. In this particular case, what we're making has both elements. So we can talk to that. I also think there's some sort of thing in the air that we're completely focused on mobile games, which is actually not true.
I hear that a lot.
Yes, I don't know where that came from, but it's somehow, I think it's because, like we said, we're working on Unity. And the fact that we're building with small teams, people just kind of connect these dots.
Yeah.
So one thing I can announce is our first game is going to be a PC-focused game. So I think it might eventually go cross-platform, but it's a PC game. It's definitely much more for a core audience. We're not going to suddenly go out and make Candy Crush. I think our time at Blizzard taught us well, what gamers want.
And also sort of, I think that whole process that you just talked about demonstrates this idea of we're all gamers and we're making something that we are passionate about.
Yeah.
And it's something that everybody on the team, who was on the team at the time, which was a lot of people who are still there, were really passionate about. And that they also felt like that they could have a big impact on that. Because that's something you said, understandably is very important to developers and the people that we're trying to hire and to bring into Bonfire.
Yeah. Well, and I think when you get back to this idea of like company culture, so we're, I think, very thoughtful about it, and we can talk about core values, we can talk about being intentional, but really, at the end of the day, your culture is your people. And I think that's the thing we think a lot about is like, who are the people we want to add to Bonfire, and how are they going to add to our culture, not just fit into our culture?
Yeah, this is sort of this idea of culture fit, I think, has become definitely, it's become a little bit maligned, I think, in the industry, because you get that concern if you're just trying to get sort of the same cookie cutter person over and over again, which is definitely not what we're trying to do. But try to find people who will fit into our culture and have a positive contribution, not only craft-wise, but also in energy and personality, and also treat each other well and sort of have a positive impact on the culture.
Yeah, no, for sure. And and I think the number one thing, like Bonfire's responsibility, like management, leadership's responsibility, is like, how do we make the best teams? And then I feel like at that point you just invest in the teams and let the teams drive their projects and drive their business, if you will. I almost look at like each team as its own startup that should be able to operate, almost entirely flat, which I think you can do when you have really small teams, and let that team kind of brain meld, become a really strong team, and then trust them to make the right decisions.
Yes, I was, I'm always sort of not surprised, but impressed. Like, you take this sort of idea of being a head cheerleader seriously, which is his official title on the website.
Yes. Yeah, I guess, I learned a lot of good and bad lessons about myself and about leadership from my time at Blizzard. At Blizzard, I think, we just have a much more, I think, traditional structure. So, you kind of end up in these management and leadership jobs where you feel like the right thing for you is to give everyone the right answers and give the decisions. And I guess what I've tried to do a lot at Bonfire is reverse that. And I feel like my job is to sit down with people and help them talk through things, and then hopefully give them the confidence in making the decision that they already want to make. But I try not to shortcut to like telling people answers anymore. Now I'm like, hey, let's just talk through this thing. Did you look at it from this angle? Did you go talk to these 3 people? And then ultimately, what is it you want to do? It's like, okay, well, let's do that.
I mean, I think it's a tradition, it's a transition for all of us, because everybody came from those companies. And so everybody's used to that idea of, I need some paper. How do I get that? And at Bonfire, the answer is go buy it.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, and even down, I think there's just so much of, I think if you trust people to be adults and trust people to be business owners, then they'll actually surprise you and be really thoughtful about how they do things. And that, I guess, gets back to another like key tenet, right? Like, we want everyone to bring into Bonfire owners of Bonfire. And I think that's something that we'll always continue to do as long as we're an independent company, is make sure that people that come in, they own a piece of Bonfire. But even more importantly is they really treat it like they're an owner of Bonfire.
Well, I mean, I think the two things go hand in hand, because in the end of the day, when you're spending Bonfire's money, it's your money. Like, you're doing what you can to make Bonfire, the best possible place that you can. Yep. And I think that helps, color our, just even the little decisions. It doesn't always go perfectly, my vision of what an appropriate costing hotel room might be different than your, it's like there's this.
What? We all have different values?
We all have different values, and we all have different ideas of how we should spend money. So we do run into these things, but I think the important part about what we try to do at Bonfire all the time is that we talk about it.
Yeah.
And listen to each other. So everyone sort of has their opinion, and we try to really enforce that value as much as we can.
Yeah, and the thing is, we're all people, so we can be a bit of a mess, especially when we're building these relationships with each other. But I guess that's one of the things I think we're trying to do, and we didn't really think of it this way early on, but I think increasingly we're trying to be comfortable being uncomfortable with conversations and not letting just things simmer, right? Like, if there's something going on or there's some unspoken thing, well, let's get out in the open and let's talk about it. And yeah, it might be icky and it might be difficult to talk about, but it's going to be really healthy for us in the long term, and we're going to build more trust as a studio and as a team.
Yeah, we're spending a lot of time right now trying to figure out how to really get that idea of like pulling feedback to yourself, integrated into the culture. It's definitely a work in progress. And positive and negative feedback as well, because the negative feedback, I think, is almost the easier one than getting in that habit of positive.
I think it depends on your personality.
I
think we're a very critical group, so we very quickly go to the critical. But no, it's a really interesting idea. Like, that's another thing where I think you can do a different pivot with how you do feedback. Again, I think at the traditional company, It's something that is management's responsibility. We come up with some sort of review process, usually annually, and you spend a bunch of time, and then you go push feedback down to each individual employee. Like, we're like, okay, well, there's something broken there because the average person actually wants to get feedback. They want to get better, but they somehow end up dreading the annual performance review. So, like, there's just some weird disconnect there.
And it's also not very timely, because you might learn something that would have been really useful to you 6 months ago.
Yeah. So I think what we try to do is, like, we make the responsibility for getting feedback each person. And it's like, you pick your feedback coaches, and you go out, and you need to get feedback from people, and you pull that feedback to you, and then you're responsible for it, and you can decide what you want to do with it.
Yep.
So
that is it for our time. Thank you so much for listening. Yay, you're amazing.